Okay, in the first video that we did on our verb overview, we talked about what a verb is. It imparts action or state to a clause, and therefore a sentence, because a sentence has to have at least one clause. Okay, and then we talked about lexical verbs versus grammatical verbs, and how even though there are far more lexical verbs than there are grammatical verbs, you actually see them about the same amount of times in a given piece of writing. Okay, and then we started talking more about the lexical verbs, and we talked about the 5 forms that a lexical verb can take. And in this video, I want to talk about the types of lexical verbs. And there are 4, actually 5, because I'm going to take one and kind of subdivide it into subtypes. So the first one we're going to talk about, because it's easier to talk about what something is than what it isn't, are the transitive verbs, and we'll use have as an example. And so let's write a sentence. Dan has, need a determiner, and what do we give Dan? Dan has a computer. Okay, and transitive is, I believe it's Latin, but somebody might want to check me on that. Trans is the word for across. Okay, and what a transitive verb does is transfer the action from the subject to this second part. And this part we call the subject. It's what the sentence is about. Okay, and this is something we call the this is what we call the object. Okay, and we'll leave it at that for now. It's a more specific term. And then the verb. So the subject, the verb, and the object. So a transitive verb transfers the action from the subject to the object. So Dan has. Dan has what? Dan has a computer. So the having that Dan is doing is having a computer. So Dan is reading a book. Dan is writing a novel. Okay. Dan is playing a game. Okay, these are all transitive verbs. Okay, now the opposite of that, I'm going to put that down here as C. It'll all make sense when I get finished, I hope, are the intransitive. And in is just a prefix that means not. And there aren't a lot of these, but there are some. And we'll use laugh. So Dan, again, is our subject, laughed. Okay, and we don't need anything. He didn't laugh something. He didn't. He just laughed. The action goes right back to the subject. Okay, so it's intransitive. Now it turns out that there are very few intransitive verbs, or that are always intransitive. There are more verbs that are always transitive, but again, the biggest number fall into the middle category here. And those are words that can be used either intransitively or transitively. And the first kind of subgroup here, I will label transitive and intransitive, because this is how you'll see it in the dictionary usually. Okay, and these are words that can be either transitive or intransitive, and they retain their meaning when they do that. They have the exact same meaning. So let's go get Dan again. And Dan, let's see, what did he do last weekend? Dan baked. Okay, and I can stop right there. Okay, I either don't know or don't care what Dan baked last weekend, but he baked. Okay, but then again, remember we can do this both ways. get rid of the period. Dan baked, what did he bake? He bakes, let's use a indefinite determiner or an indefinite quantifier, some. I don't know exactly how many. And then what did he bake? He baked some cookies. Okay, so in this case, Dan is baking something. He's baking some cookies. So the transitive verb is transferring the action to the cookies. Now again, the definition of baked hasn't changed. It's still taking water and flour and some other things, mixing them all up, making a big mess in the kitchen, taking what's left over, sticking it in the oven, heating it up for a period of time, and then hopefully at the end you end up with something that tastes good. Okay, so that's baking. It doesn't change whether you do it, intransitively or transitively. Now, there's another kind of verb, and I'll write it this way because it will have two different meanings, usually very closely related, but it'll have two different meanings depending on whether it's used transitively or intransitively. And open is a good example of a fairly common pattern. Okay, so let's let's have Dan sit down for a while, and we'll go get another subject, the door. Okay, it's the subject, that's what we're talking about, and the door opened. Okay, sounds like a sentence from a detective novel. Okay, but the door opened. So opened is the action, and the door is what is being opened. The subject is what is being opened. Now, let's have Dan stand up again. Okay, and we'll use it transitively. Dan opened. So I should have left myself a little bit more room. The door. Now we'll make door the object, and it's what Dan is opening, or what Dan opened, past tense. Okay, so in this definition, what's being opened is the door. Okay, and you say, well, it's the same thing. It's close. It's not quite. In one case, open is what happens to the subject, and in the other case, opened is what the subject does to something else. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in other videos, but I want to get the fourth one or the fifth one, depending on how you're counting, and that's a copular verb, and that's the technical term, and the most common one. The most common copular verb is be. And a copular verb generally describes a state or a change of state. And what a copular verb does is link information after the verb back to the subject. Okay? It's giving us information that completes the thought about the subject. So let's put an example up. Okay, Dan is, okay, what is Dan? Dan is an engineer. Okay, it's always a good thing. Okay, so an engineer. Is Dan doing something to an engineer? Is he transferring some action to an engineer? No. Engineer is just, in this case, this noun phrase, an engineer, is just giving us more information about Dan. Okay? So, this is what we call a complement. Okay, it's giving us more information. And because it's giving us more information about the subject, it's specifically a subject complement. And we're going to find out there's other kinds of complements that complete the thought, complete the thought represented by another word. Okay. And so Dan is an engineer. So here we used a noun phrase. Does it have to be a noun phrase? Well, no, actually it doesn't. Okay, so we won't use a noun phrase this time. We will use, and it's still a subject complement, we will use a prepositional phrase. So Dan is in, there's the preposition. And he's in what? He's in or where? He's in Virginia. Okay? So again, this is giving us more information about Dan. This is helping complete our picture of Dan. You know, he's not in Zimbabwe. He's not in Cambodia. He's in Virginia. Okay? And the fact that he's not in Zimbabwe, let's get rid of the prepositional phrase. Okay. And let's put in an adjective phrase. Dan is, let me get that. Dan is very, use an adverb. Dan is very happy. He's either very happy he's an engineer or very happy he's not in Zimbabwe. Very happy he's in Virginia. Okay, so again, this is an adjective, and again, it's giving us more information, you know, about Dan. Okay, so with that, those are the 4 or 5 types, again, depending on how you want to count them. And there's the transitive, there's the 2 versions of can be either transitive or intransitive. There are the ones that are always intransitive. Again, that's a rather small group. And then there's, actually this is an even smaller group, and those are the copulars. Oh, one term you'll often see, because in one sense we're linking the concept of happy with Dan, or vice versa. So these are sometimes called linking verbs. Okay? So, with that, I think we will stop here and come back in the next video and talk about the 12 grammatical verbs.